What's up, Pen Pirates crew? It's your boy Adrian, and we're back with another video. So as you can see today, we're going to be talking about Magellan and its recent kind of rise in popularity. This is something I've been wanting to make, but it just kept getting pushed back for other videos, and I'm actually glad it got pushed back because now we have a top 5 finish in Tyler Bollin's Pro Play Games top that we could talk about, and this is kind of like a proven deck that is now on the rise. But with that being said, let's get into first the Magellan leader skill, and then we'll talk about some strengths and weaknesses. So for those of you that don't know, Magellan's leader skill is actually pretty simple. It's just once per turn during your turn. When a Dawn card is returned from the field to the Dawn deck, you're going to gain 1000 power for this turn. And the most common application for this is obviously on your turn, you're going to be able to swing a little bit more aggressively when you use those Dawn minus effects, like with your X-Drake, with your Douglas Bullets, your Magellans, your 6-cost Kings, pretty much the multitude of Dawn minus effects that purple has. You're going to be able to take advantage and get value out of them, past what the on-play effect is. And this is really important because it's giving you pretty much a free Dawn to swing with onto your leader. Swinging with 6k is pretty cool into the 5k leaders because it demands a 2k counter out of their hand. But also it's really important in this meta specifically because now we have to deal with a bunch of Whitebeard. And that plus 1000 means everything, right? Because a lot of decks right now, if they play on curve, they actually sacrifice not swinging at Whitebeard's leader, which means that that player is going to have more cards in their hand. They're going to have a safer 9-cost Whitebeard turn, which is what you don't want. So the fact that Magellan can, still play on curve and get that plus 1000 from his effect is actually really significant in this meta. And then also, just remember, this is mainly for locals and people that are newer to playing the deck. This is only an effect that works on your turn. So, he won't gain plus 1000 on your opponent's turn if you play something like a Hell's Judgment. I've seen that a couple of times in my locals, so just watch out for it. This is an effect that is only available on your turn. So getting right into what makes this deck strong, and we're going to get into the specific cards of these later, but just in a general sense, this deck has great board presence. It has an ability to go wide very early on in the game, and then in the mid game you have these huge tempo swing turns with your Jailer Beast engine, and also with 6-cost King. He's just going to swing the board in your favor in most cases, especially into matchups like Whitebeard, because now he's even better since he could KO a 4-cost. And that wasn't really relevant in OP1, right? Because usually you were going after Okikus or Robins with this King effect, but nowadays you could go after the Yamatos that Kinemon has. Whitebeard has a multitude of 4-cost vanillas that they really like. Even Marco could be a target for this card. So you have some really high value targets to use for this effect. And then on top of that, this goes into my next point where you just get aggressive value for going Dawn minus, right? Where previously you kind of go Dawn minus with the King effect and you don't really get anything past the KO. Now you get a little bit more bang for your buck because you could play 6-cost King on curve, go Dawn -1, and then get a 6k swing out of that. And that makes a huge difference in the long run of the game, right? Because especially if you are using this effect in multiple turns, that plus 1000 each turn is really going to add up and stack up when your opponent needs to counter out, especially when you're trying to manipulate and control the board. Getting that plus 1000 to swing at a character, it just gives you so much value because it's going to demand cards out of your opponent's hand. Into my next point, this deck has a very unique way of disrupting your opponent's plays, in that the fact that it has that 5-cost Magellan. And we're going to get into that more in depth later, but very quickly, 5-cost Magellan just lets you make your opponent go Dawn -1. So then, and that could really mess your opponent up, especially for a deck that's trying its best to play on curve. The best example for this is probably just pure black, because they're playing and going second and trying to play that 10-cost Kuzan as soon as possible. So you making them go Dawn minus and then having to delay that 10-cost Kuzan one more turn could just make all the difference throughout the game. And as the Magellan player, it's really important that you just understand what decks want out of their curve so that you can just play this Magellan at the worst possible moment for them, and also just make their whole life kind of more difficult because now you have a better understanding of what they can play within the turn and you could play around it in the next turn. And this next point is kind of related to the first, where it's about its board presence. This deck has a very awkward board to deal with between, having to play around the Uta rest and also having to play around the on KO effect of Magellan. it's just really difficult to decide what to swing at and in what order sometimes, especially when you factor in things like, you know, having Queen Blocker or even having like Hell's Judgment. So swinging with like the correct math sometimes is also very difficult. So this deck actually has like some really tricky board states that your opponent is going to have to like reason and make decisions out of, and that could just be very complicated, especially if they're not familiar with this deck. That's also like kind of a hidden pseudo strength of this deck, is that it's not that common right now. So a lot of the plays like they're kind of like shrouded in mystery on how to play around them, right? And then the last thing is that this deck is actually way more consistent than other purple decks, and by other purple decks I mean Kaido, because you're running the Hannibal. And granted, Kaido also runs Hannibal, but not in the way that Magellan does, right? Because in Magellan, you're running also the Jailer Beast combos, like with Sadie and Minotaur and Minakawala. So you can hit a lot more IMPEL down cards, and they're also way more impactful, right? In Kaido, they're usually only for your defensive options. You're grabbing your 2k counters, you're grabbing Hell's Judgment, or you're grabbing like the blocker, right? It also has the added benefit of not relying on that ramp with Onigashima and just having that ramp in its characters like Minakawala and Minotaur. So of course, we got into the strengths, let's go into the weaknesses. Starting off with, this isn't your typical purple deck, so there's not a much ramp compared to like purple Kaido. You still do have a little bit of ramp in Minakawala and Minotaur's on KO effects, but other than that, you're still going Dawn minus during your turn, and of course you are getting that plus 1000 attack, but sometimes that's just not enough, and it can make your turns like very awkward and your curves awkward if you're not being careful and kind of planning out when you want to go Dawn minus. So especially when you're playing like against aggro decks and you have to also account for like the Hell's Judgment Dawn minus, it could be very tricky to kind of have like a playable amount of Dawn where you're getting a lot of value out of the cards in your hand per turn. And in Kaido, you don't really have to worry about that, right? You have to worry about it a little bit, but mainly for things and like your big threats like, you know, 9 and 10 cost Kaido. And unless you use one of those big Dawn minus effects, most of the time it's not really going to affect your overall curve if you go Dawn -1, Dawn -2, because you have that ramp every single turn with Island. And this problem kind of trickles into my next point, where the endgame threats in purple, they are actually a little bit more difficult to run in this deck. And this is something that Tyler, you know, the person who topped with this deck, says himself, where the bigger threats like Douglas Bullet and 9 cost Kaido, they're a lot harder to run because they're really awkward for your turns, right? With this deck, you kind of want to go wide and create a big board that is very threatening to your opponent. And those big endgame threats are really good for closing out games and everything like that, but they're also huge commitments within your turn, not only in the amount of Dawn that they cost, but going Dawn minus like 4 or 5 is actually really scary with this deck, right? Because it puts you behind by quite a bit. And this kind of sucks, because if you can't play these endgame threats, you might just lose to other endgame threats that other decks have, right? Like Whitebeard has the 9 cost, so does Zoro, Kinemon has that Odin that you need to worry about, and these are cards that put your opponent on a clock, right? They have to answer them or have some sort of way to survive them out if they want to win the game, but with Magellan, you don't really have that, so all they have to do is answer your threats on the board, and if they're not like these huge beat sticks or they don't have these like really big grand effects, it might be a little bit harder to fight your way through that board. And it, of course, in no means is it impossible, but when other decks are running these big endgame threats, it puts now you on a clock, and instead of you thinking, oh, I just need to play the Douglas Bullet or I need to play the 9 cost Kaido and just kind of ride it to win the game, you now have to think of, this is what I need to do X, Y, and Z to, you know, win the game, control the board, and then ultimately like also live my opponent's win condition or endgame threat on the board. And a little bit related is our next point, in that this deck loses to decks that can just control the board better. So if, you know, you run into a black player and they draw all of their like meaningful destruction effects and they're using it on your important cards, it's going to be really difficult to execute your game plan, right? Which is, you want to make a big, wide, awkward, threatening board for your opponent to deal with, and you want to just keep riding this board up until they die, pretty much. You're just going to keep poking them. You have the Minotaur for the double attack to kind of accelerate that process, But other than that, you don't really have these huge effects that have to be played around, right? You're kind of working slowly, building your board, and then also dealing with your opponent's board. So a deck like green, like black, that are kind of, they excel at board control, it could be difficult to take games off of them. And this goes for things that aren't necessarily board control either, like Doflamingo. I find that this deck struggles a little bit against Dofi because of its board swarming capabilities, right? So if you're not able to like compete with the board, you pretty much have no win condition outside of that like other decks do. And you know, decks that just excel in that board control are going to have that inherent advantage against you. And then for that last point, you know, I did mention one of the shadow strengths of this deck is that not a lot of people are playing it right now, so it could kind of catch you off guard. But other than that, like if you're very familiar with the cards and the game plan of this deck, it's actually very easy to play around because the plays are very linear, especially the 5-cost Magellan. It seems like a very good card if, you know, it kind of catches you off guard, you have like a turn played out, and then now you have to think about another one on the fly. But if you're expecting all of these cards, you know what the Uta does, and you kind of understand where to sequence your, you know, attacks and where to play your cards, it's actually very easy to play around. And I'll go into this a lot more in detail in a little bit, especially with the 5-cost Magellan. But if you're expecting it, it's very easy to come up with a plan for that turn. And then also it's kind of easy to come up with a plan for how to take it out and what turn you want to do it on. So as promised, we are now going to get into the portion where we just look at what cards make this deck strong. A lot of these cards are newer, you know, in OP2, starting off with the IMPEL down engine that we have. And this card is just great because it's going to be a searcher like Nami, right? Except for IMPEL down cards. So you're going to look at the top 5 cards of your deck, pick any IMPEL down type card, and then bottom deck the rest. So this can search out your Magellans, it could search out your Jailer Beast package that we're going to talk about next. And then also, it could search out Hell's Judgment, which is super important because what this means is that Hannibal is a great early game play for getting something on board like against Zoro and against like the decks that want to go wider and more aggressive. But also, you don't really mind drawing this card in the late game, right? Because you could grab things like a Hell's Judgment. You could grab things like the Mina Koala as a blocker. So it gives you a lot more options in general besides the consistency. And then also, we're of course playing the 5-cost character Magellan. He is a 5-cost 6k with no counter, but his on-play effect is go Dawn -1 and then make your opponent go Dawn -1. And this is the effect that I was talking about that can just really disrupt your opponent's curve, especially black players if they go second, because they're going to get that Kuzan out one turn behind, and because of that they might just be behind in tempo by the time it comes out, or they might not be in a safe spot if you're like going wide and going, you know, aggressively correctly. So it actually might be like very detrimental to get this Kuzan out a turn behind. And then also on top of that, on your opponent's turn, he gains the effect of on KO, you're gonna make your opponent go Dawn -2. So he is ideally getting rid of 3 Dawn, and that effect can also be very disruptive, right? Because your opponent might want to swing into this card, especially leaders like Whitebeard, where they don't want you to have a free 6k swing every single turn. So they might be swinging into this, but then they also have to sacrifice the fact that they're going to be losing out on a turn's worth of like resources that they're gaining, right? And that puts them in a very awkward and difficult position because it's getting a free 6k on something or a leader like Whitebeard. If you attach 1 Dawn to it, you're swinging for that magic 7k onto a 5k leader. And then also, like, it's not exactly like Jet Pistol proof, but like removal cards are even less appealing, right? Because yeah, sure, you're getting rid of the 6k body, but you're also just giving more Dawn up to do it. So you have to like reconsider whether you even want to get rid of this card. And then of course, I don't think I have to spend too much time on this. Hell's Judgment is one of the best, if not the best event cards out right now. So it's a 2-cost event where you go Dawn -1, and then you're going to give up to 2 of your opponent's leader or character cards -3000 power during this turn. And this is really good into aggressive decks or mid-range decks because it basically negates 2 attacks, and you could be really tricky with it, right? Because if your opponent is not thinking about this math correctly, right, this is a -3000 power event card, not -2000 or 4000 like what you're used to seeing. So if your opponent is really lazy and they're not thinking about this card, they can actually like swing for what they think is magic numbers and then just get perfectly countered out of it while getting another character's attack like negated because of the other -3000. This card is also searchable off of Hannibal, which is just so amazing, right? Like you could potentially find this wherever you need it during the game. Speaking of Hannibal, he could also search out any of this Jailer Beast package that we have access to right now. Starting off with Sadie, she's a 3-cost 3k and a 2k counter. And then she has the on-play effect of just play up to 1 Jailer Beast type card from your hand. And right now we have access to 2 Jailer Beast type cards. They're both going to be a 4-cost 5k with 1k counter, except Minotaur has double attack and Minokoala has blocker. And of course they both have the same on KO effect that just ramps you 1 Dawn if your leader has the IMPEL down type, which of course Magellan has. But going back to Sadie, this card is just amazing, especially in this meta. Her on-play effect lets you play her and just get a 5k body that has an extra effect, which is amazing. And then also, she's 3k, which is pretty important in this meta, especially if you're going against Zoro, because that means you could go a little bit wider than normal purple decks would go. And that just allows you to swing into things like Sunny-kun, into Nami's for Zoro. You could use Sadie to swing into, you know, Momonosuke's and Bonnie's. And this goes for Hannibal too, being at 2k. So these are cards that Purple has access to now where like they're low cost. They're at this threshold that can, you know, swing at the things like the Bonnies and the Sunny-kuns and just all of like the 1-cost character cards. But also Sadie has that added effect of giving you that extra 5k body, which is pretty significant. And on top of that, the 5k bodies that you get have extra effects, like Minotaur has double attack, which can really put on some early game pressure, especially if you're playing this on curve. And you might even demand like more cards out of your opponent's hand, especially for like a slower deck. Minokoala is a blocker with 5k power, so you know you could attack with him, or you can just use him to like kind of hunker down, right? Because this is not going to be taken out by things like Vista or by Whitebeard effect without something like an Otama being paired with it. So that makes it more difficult, and any time that you can like be a little bit more difficult and have a stickier board, the better, right? So this Jailer Beast is really just going to serve well for the entire game plan, right? Because you're going to be able to go a little bit more wider than most purple decks can. And then also on top of that, you have the extra value that their on KO effect brings, where you just ramp 1 Dawn. And then another package that we kind of see in this deck is the film package. First off, we're running Shiki, which is a new 2k counter that purple players usually play. And he has the added effect on trigger. If you go Dawn -1, you get to play this card for free. And this goes into that, you know, mentality that I was saying earlier, where you want to go wide with this deck and have a board that is a little bit threatening. Shiki just helps out with that, especially into like the more aggro matchups. If you have something with a 3k body on board that could kind of swing at the Sunny-kuns, that can swing at the Namis and the Makinos and everything, you're going to have a much better time in the early game and surviving. And, you know, you don't even have to necessarily get the trigger effect to play Shiki, right? You could just play him for 2 Dawn, and then that's it. And then, of course, we have Uta, which is making her return. She's a 4-cost 5k with plus 1000 power, which is honestly really good. If she had no counter power, this card would still be really good because she's a blocker, which, again, blockers with high stats are really important in this meta because a lot of the chump blockers just aren't cutting it with the Vistas and, you know, the Whitebeard effect. And then on top of that, she also has the on-block effect of go Dawn -1 and then rest one of your opponent's characters that cost 5 or less. And again, this makes your opponent's plays a little bit more complicated and your board a little bit more awkward, right? Because if they want to get the maximum amount of value out of their swings, they have to sequence in a very specific way and decide, you know, what they want to swing with and what they want to get value off with. But on top of that, some decks just might not even be able to play around this. Decks like Whitebeard, like Zoro, they're always going to have multiple 5-cost characters on board. So what you can do, especially against Zoro, is like just block and then counter 1000. And then also just rest another card that they were planning on attacking with, which you pretty much got rid of 2 attackers and then for 1 card out of your hand. And then on top of that, they now have to deal with the Uta, so she might even eat another swing after that. And then, of course, into things like Whitebeard, she's even more important because into Strawbeard, you're going to be resting a lot of their vanillas. Into the Moby Dick version that people are still playing, or the hybrid version even, you could rest their Marcos on their turn, which, you know, they're not going to be attacking with them, but they are definitely going to be on the board. So it might come up where like you're just resting a Marco and then you're going for game next turn. It gives you access to game. And then, of course, a card that I think a lot of people overlooked is going to be the Douglas Bullet. He's a 5-cost 6k with 1k power, and then on play you're going to go Dawn -1, so activating that +1000 for your leader effect, and you're going to rest up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 4 or less. So this card is basically Okiku on a 5-cost, and he has an amazing stat line of 6k, which is going to be able to swing at Whitebeard, but he's really important for resting those blockers that you need to, right? Because Black has things like Borsellino that you can't KO, you have to maneuver around them in another way, like bouncing them, or in this case resting them. This is going to be able to rest those Marcos or any like vanillas that you want to take out and deal with. So he's actually a very good card in this meta because he's just going to be able to hit a lot of high value targets. And then on top of that, you are going to be left with a 6k body on board, which is going to help you with that, you know, board state win condition that you want, where you have a lot of like threatening characters on board. And then going right into Tyler's list, this is the list he used to go top 5 at Pro Play Games online regionals. He's running 4 of that IMPEL down package we were looking at, you know, the Hanya Ball, the Hell's Judgment, and then the 5-cost Magellan. He's also running 4 of each of the Jailer Beast package that we were looking at. So again, just staying very consistent with this IMPEL down archetype. And then also he's running the pretty standard purple cards that I would say, like X-Drake is a 2k counter that we always see, right? Like it's a great 2k counter. It has a great on-play effect of ripping a card out of your opponent's hand. And then also we're running 4 Queens. That makes a lot of sense too. Another card that, you know, you can't really take out of a purple deck. It's going to give you that draw power, give you a really good body for a blocker and even an attacker. Of course, we're running 4 of the 6-cost Kings, which fits perfectly into this deck because it goes into that game plan where you want to be able to like control the board a little bit, but also just have a threatening board for yourself, right? So King is going to let you just get that tempo swing, KO something on your opponent's board, and then leave yourself with a big 7k body to be able to swing with. And then you'll notice that there's a card in here that I did not talk about, and that's Guild Tesoro. And that's because Tyler himself has said that he's going to cut this card in the future and that it did not come up that often. For those of you that don't know, Guild Tesoro is another film card that comes out of the structure deck. He's a 5-cost 6k power character. And then when he's attacking, if you go Dawn -2, you get to draw 2 cards. And this is great in theory, but I think the reason why it's a little bit clunky in this deck is because you have so many other cards that you'd kind of rather play. You know, Guild Tesoro doesn't really push your game state like you want other cards to do. Like if you play, you know, it's fighting for the same spot as Bullet, which is gonna give you some board control. Magellan, which is super disruptive. Queen is gonna like progress your board state with a blocker and then still draw you more cards on play. Finding the right moment to play this card is pretty difficult and like kind of few and far between, so it probably will be cut in the future for something more useful, like I don't know, like more 2k counters or maybe even some endgame threats. But what do you guys think about this new archetype that we're looking at? I know personally for me and my locals, it looks like a really fun and cool deck to play. It's very unique and kind of different than a lot of the other decks that are out there right now. But let me know how you feel about it in the comments down below. Thank you all for watching, and of course make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos like this. We are almost at 1,000 subscribers, which absolutely blows my mind. When I first made this channel, I did not think that, you know, people were actually going to watch this content, and it means a lot to me that, you know, I'm able to put out like educational stuff that you guys find value in. But of course, as always, good luck in any of your career endeavors, you know, your school, whatever you're doing in the future, and I'll see you guys on the next one.